They brought her out under the noon sun like something to be measured, priced, and forgotten. And the first man who laughed did it too easily, like he'd done it before, like this was just another day in Dry Creek where dust settled thicker than mercy, and people learned to look away before asking why. And she stood there with her hands bound but her back straight, eyes forward, not begging, not breaking, just waiting as if time itself belonged to her, and not to the men shouting numbers from the crowd. And the auctioneer, Silas Crow, tipped his hat low with a grin that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Step closer, folks. You won't find better stock this side of the ridge." And a few boots scraped forward across the wooden planks. Coins clinked. Someone muttered something about her being too quiet, too proud, and Crow laughed again, louder this time. "Don't worry, she'll learn." And that was when the wind shifted just enough to carry the smell of hot leather and horse sweat through the square, just enough to make a man at the edge of the crowd lift his head. Not fast, not dramatic, just a slow recognition that something in the air had gone wrong long before he arrived. And he stood there for a moment, saying nothing, his shadow stretching across the dirt like it had business to finish, while up on the platform Crow circled her once, tapping the toe of his boot against the wood. "Won't even speak," he said. And the crowd answered with a low ripple of amusement, not cruel enough to call it hatred, not kind enough to call it anything else, just the sound people make when they forget someone is human. And she didn't react, didn't lower her eyes, didn't give them what they wanted, and that unsettled a few of them more than any defiance could have, because silence like that doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't apologize, it just stays, and Crow didn't like that, not one bit. So he reached for her arm, not rough, not gentle either, just enough to turn her toward the light like he was proving a point. "Look at her," he called out, strong as they come, and not a word to argue with. And more laughter, easier now, safer now, because nobody wanted to be the one who stopped it. Nobody wanted to be the first to say this didn't sit right. And that's how towns like this kept going, one quiet agreement at a time, until someone broke it. And that someone finally moved, a single step forward that didn't make a sound but carried anyway, like thunder too far off to hear yet. And a few heads turned, not all, just enough, because men notice when another man walks without hesitation, when he doesn't ask for space but takes it. And he came through the line of onlookers with the kind of calm that doesn't belong to this kind of place. Dust on his coat, hat low, hands empty, and still something about him made the noise in the square drop a notch, just enough to be felt, not named. And Crow saw him too, mid-sentence, smile tightening just a fraction. "You here to bid?" he called, voice still easy, still playing to the crowd, but his eyes had sharpened, measuring, and the man didn't answer right away, just stopped a few feet from the platform and looked up, not at Crow, but at her. And it wasn't a long look, not something anyone else would have marked, but it stayed, like he was reading something written there that no one else could see. And then he shifted his gaze, finally, to the auctioneer, and asked, quiet as dry grass, "How much?" And that was enough to bring the laughter back, louder this time, relieved, because it meant nothing had changed. This was still a game, still a sale, still something they understood, and Crow spread his arms wide, playing it up. "Depends on what you think she's worth." And someone in the crowd shouted a number, too low to matter. Another voice raised it. A third doubled it just to hear themselves say it. And the numbers climbed, not because of her, not really, but because men like to hear their own voices when there's something to win. And through it all she didn't move, didn't react, just watched. And maybe it was the way she watched, steady, unafraid, that made the man in the dust coat speak. Again, same tone, same calm. "That your final price?" And Crow grinned, sensing the moment stretching. "For you?" he said, naming a number high enough to draw a few whistles, high enough to make it clear this wasn't meant to be accepted. And for the first time the man's hand moved, not to his belt, not to his hat, just into his coat, slow, deliberate. And something in that motion shifted the air again, not fear, not yet, just a tension sharpening like a blade being drawn without sound. And he pulled out a folded paper, held it between two fingers like it weighed nothing at all, and said, "I'll take her." Not loud, not forceful, just certain. And the words landed heavier than they should have, like they carried something no one had accounted for. And the laughter didn't come this time, not right away, because something in his voice didn't leave room for it. And Crow's smile held, but only on the surface, while underneath something flickered, quick and sharp, and up on the platform, for the first time. The woman's eyes shifted, not away, not down, but toward him, like she'd been waiting for that exact sentence to be spoken, like everything before it had just been noise leading here. And no one in Dry Creek understood yet what had just changed, only that the heat felt different, the dust heavier, and the silence longer than it should be. No one moved at first, not because they understood what had just happened, but because something in the way he said it left no space for reaction, and that kind of silence was unfamiliar in a place like Dry Creek, where noise usually filled every gap before thought could catch up. And Silas Crow stood there with that same stretched smile, the kind a man wears when he is deciding whether to laugh or to listen, and he chose laughter, because that was safer, because that was what the town expected of him. "Well now," he said, drawing the words out slow. "Sounds like we got ourselves a buyer who does not know how this works." And a few in the crowd picked it up, chuckles rolling back in like a tide trying to reclaim ground it had lost. But it did not sound the same, not as easy, not as certain, and the man in the dust coat did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply stepped closer to the platform, boots finding each board with deliberate weight, and the wood answered with a low creak that carried farther than it should have. And from up there, the woman watched him approach, her gaze steady, unafraid, as if she had already decided something about him that the rest of them had not yet seen. And Crow tilted his head, studying him now with more care. "That price was not a suggestion," he said. "That was the cost." And the man nodded once, small, almost respectful. "I heard you," he replied, and for a moment it seemed like the moment might pass. Like this would end the way most things did in Dry Creek, with a shrug and a return to business. But then the paper in his hand shifted slightly in the light, just enough for Crow to notice, just enough for his eyes to flick down and back up again. And something tightened in his jaw, subtle, but there, and the crowd began to sense it too, not understanding, just feeling the edges of something changing shape. And one of the men near the front cleared his throat, stepping back half a foot without meaning to, like his boots had made the decision before he had. And the auctioneer straightened, drawing himself up taller, voice sharpening just a touch. "You planning to pay, or are you just here to waste my time?" And the answer came just as calm as before. "I am here to finish it." And that was not the answer anyone expected, not in those words, not in that tone. And the breeze moved again, lifting a line of dust across the square, carrying with it the faint jingle of a distant harness, the creak of leather, the quiet things that usually went unnoticed. But not now, not in this stillness. And the man unfolded the paper fully, slow enough that every eye followed, and the sound of it opening seemed louder than it had any right to be, like the tearing of something unseen. And he held it out, not high, not low, just at a height that demanded it be looked at. And Crow hesitated, only for a second. But in that second the crowd leaned in without realizing, drawn by the weight of a moment they could not name. And when Crow finally took the paper, his fingers did not close around it the way they had around coins all morning. There was caution there now, and he scanned it quickly, then again, slower, and the grin faded, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a mask being set down carefully so no one could hear it fall, and no one spoke, not even the men who had been shouting bids just moments ago, because something in Crow's face told them this was no longer their show. And the man on the platform did not rush him, did not press. He simply stood there, hands empty again, eyes steady, as if he had all the time in the world and none of it belonged to anyone else. And beside them, the woman shifted for the first time, not in fear, not in discomfort, just a small movement of breath, like someone stepping into a truth they had already accepted. And Crow lowered the paper slightly, eyes lifting to meet the man's, and whatever he saw there made him swallow before he spoke. "You do not get to bring this here," he said, quieter now, the edge gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain, and the man answered. It was already here, and that was when the murmur began, low, spreading from one side of the square to the other, not words at first, just sound, the kind people make when they realize they have been standing on something that might not hold. And one of the older men near the back shook his head, slow, as if trying to place a memory he did not want to claim, and another looked toward the empty space where the sheriff's office stood 2 blocks over, door closed, window dark, and only now noticing it. only now asking himself why, and Crow's grip on the paper tightened, then loosened, like he was deciding whether to keep holding on or let it go. And the man in front of him did not move, did not blink, just waited. And in that waiting there was something heavier than any threat, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And finally Crow handed the paper back, not with defiance, not with pride, just with the careful motion of someone who knows the ground beneath him has shifted and is trying not to fall with it. And the silence that followed was deeper than before, not empty, but full of things unspoken. And the woman's eyes remained on the man, steady, knowing, and somewhere in the distance. A horse stamped once, the sound carrying clean through the still air, marking the moment like a quiet verdict no one had prepared for. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog lifting off dry ground. And the first sound came from somewhere behind the crowd, a boot shifting, a throat clearing, the kind of small noise men make when they are trying to pretend nothing has changed. But everything had, and they all felt it now, even if none of them would say it. And Silas Crow stepped back half a pace on the platform, not retreating, not surrendering, just adjusting, the way a man does when he realizes the rules he has been playing by might not hold anymore. And he glanced around the square, looking for something familiar, something solid, but all he found were faces that no longer laughed the same way, eyes that no longer met his with certainty, and that unsettled him more than any spoken challenge could have. And the man in the dust coat stood exactly where he had been, not pressing forward, not claiming anything, just present. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes presence is heavier than action. And Crow forced a breath through his nose, straightened his vest, and said, louder than necessary, "This town runs on trade, not on papers waved around by strangers." And a few heads nodded, not in agreement, but in habit, because it was easier than thinking. And the man answered without raising his voice, "Then you have been trading the wrong things." And that line did not sound like an argument. It sounded like a fact. And facts have a way of settling into a place whether they are welcomed or not. And Crow's jaw tightened again, his gaze flicking toward the woman beside him, as if remembering she was still part of the stage he controlled. And for a moment, it looked like he might try to pull the moment back into something he understood, something he could manage. But when he reached out, his hand stopped just short of her arm, not touching, not this time, because something in the air had changed the distance between people, made certain gestures feel heavier than they had before. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by the crowd, not by the man watching, and certainly not by the woman, whose eyes remained steady, calm, as if she had already stepped beyond whatever this place thought it could do to her. And a boy near the edge of the square whispered something to the man beside him, too low to hear, but the man shushed him quickly, glancing toward the platform with a look that carried something close to caution. And that was new, that was different, and it spread, quiet and invisible, through the people gathered there. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes too late but stays anyway. And the man in the dust coat finally moved again, one small step to the side, enough to stand level with the platform instead of below it. And from that angle the light caught his face just enough for a few in the crowd to recognize him. Not fully, not all at once, but in pieces, a memory of a voice heard before, a presence felt in a doorway, a question asked when no one else would ask it. And the name did not travel through the crowd as a shout. It moved as a murmur, passed from one to another like something fragile. "Whitmore," someone said, almost under their breath, and another picked it up, softer still, until it reached the back of the square and settled there, heavy. And Crow heard it too. Of course he did. And his expression changed again, not as sharply this time, but deeper, like a man realizing he has been speaking in the wrong tone for longer than he should have. And he looked back at the man in front of him, really looked now, not at the coat or the dust or the paper, but at the stillness, the certainty, the way he did not need to prove anything because he had already decided what mattered. And Crow let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not carry. It fell flat between them. "You've been gone a while," he said, and the answer came just as steady, long enough to see what stayed the same. And there it was, not an accusation, not quite, but something close, something that did not need to be spelled out because everyone standing there could feel it, could see it reflected in the space between those two men. and the crowd shifted again, a step here, a glance there. People creating distance without realizing they were doing it, like the center of the square had become something they did not want to stand too close to. And on the platform, the woman drew a slow breath, the first sign of life that belonged entirely to her, not to the scene around her. And she lowered her gaze for just a moment, not in submission, but in recognition, like she had found the peace she had been waiting for. And when she lifted her eyes again, they went not to Crow, not to the crowd, but to Whitmore. And there was something in that look that did not belong to this town, something older, quieter, something that spoke of memory instead of fear, and Whitmore saw it, held it for a second longer than anything else in that square, and then he turned slightly, just enough to address the space around them without raising his voice. "This ends here," he said, and it was not a command, not in the way men usually gave them. It was a line drawn in the dust that no one felt right. Stepping across, and the wind moved again, softer now, carrying away the last of the laughter that had filled this place only minutes ago, leaving behind a stillness that felt less like emptiness and more like something waiting to be understood. The words settled into the square like dust after a long ride, not loud, not forceful, but final in a way no one there could easily ignore. And for a moment it seemed like the entire town of Dry Creek had forgotten how to move, how to speak, how to pretend this was still just another afternoon under a hard sun. And Silas Crow stood on that platform with his hands hanging at his sides, not sure where to place them now that the show had slipped from his control, and he glanced once more at the faces below him, searching for something he could lean on, some old agreement, some shared certainty, but all he found were men avoiding his eyes, shifting their weight, stepping back an inch at a time as if distance alone could separate them from what had been happening right in front of them. And that was when he understood something he had not expected to understand today. Not here, not like this, that the crowd had been with him only as long as it was easy, and now that it was not, they were already leaving him behind without taking a single step, and he let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the ground has changed beneath him and there is no steady place left to stand, and his gaze returned to Whitmore, lingering there, measuring, recalculating. "You think a piece of paper changes anything," he said. But the edge was gone now, replaced by something quieter, something closer to doubt. And Whitmore did not answer right away. He simply reached up and removed his hat, not in courtesy, not in display, just an emotion that felt deliberate, grounding, as if he was marking the moment for what it truly was. And the sunlight caught his face fully now, and there was nothing dramatic in it, no anger, no triumph. Just a stillness that carried weight, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and why. And when he spoke, his voice was no louder than before, but it reached farther than anything shouted in that square all day. "It does not change what happened," he said. "It makes sure it stops." And those words did not accuse, they did not threaten. They simply laid something bare that no one could easily deny. And Crow looked away first, not in surrender, not entirely, but in the quiet recognition that the moment was no longer his to shape. And beside him, the woman moved again, slow, controlled, lifting her bound hands just enough to feel the weight of the rope, not struggling, not testing, just acknowledging it. And Whitmore noticed, of course he did, and without asking, without announcing it, he stepped up onto the platform, the boards giving slightly under his boots, the sound small but clear, and for a second no one breathed, because this was the line. This was the moment where something could turn one way or another, and yet there was no rush in him, no urgency, only that same steady pace. And when he reached her, he did not grab, did not pull. He simply reached for the knot, fingers working with quiet precision, the way a man does when he understands that how something is done matters just as much as what is done. And the rope loosened, not all at once, but enough for her hands to come free without force, without spectacle. And when it fell away, it did not hit the ground loudly. It landed soft, almost unnoticed, except that everyone noticed it, because it marked something ending, something no one could pretend was still in place. And she did not step back, did not rush away. She remained where she was, hands now free at her sides, and she looked at Whitmore, really looked this time. And there was something in that gaze that carried years in it, distance, memory, something that did not belong to this square or this day. And she spoke, her voice low, steady. "You took your time." And a few in the crowd shifted at the sound of it, because it was the first time they had heard her speak, and it was not what they expected, not weak, not broken, but measured, as if every word had been chosen long before this moment arrived. And Whitmore held her gaze for a second, just long enough to acknowledge what stood between them, whatever it was, and then he said, just as quiet, "I had to be sure." And that answer seemed to settle something, not in the crowd, not in Crow, but in her, and she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, and then her eyes moved past him, out over the square, taking in the faces, the buildings, the place that had tried to reduce her to something less. And there was no anger in that look, no bitterness, just a clarity that made several men drop their gaze without knowing why, and Whitmore turned then, stepping down from the platform, not looking back to see if she would follow, because he did not need to, and after a moment, she did, one step, then another, until she stood beside him on the same ground as everyone else, no higher, no lower, just present, and the distance between her and the crowd felt wider than the entire square, and Crow remained where he was, still on that platform that no longer meant what it had before, hands empty now, the performance gone, and he looked out at the people who had laughed with him, who had nodded along, who had been so certain just minutes ago, and he saw something new in their faces, something he could not turn back, and no one spoke, not because they were told not to, but because there was nothing left to say that would not sound hollow in the weight of what had just happened. And the wind moved again, softer this time, lifting the edge of Whitmore's coat, stirring the dust around their boots, and somewhere far off, a church bell rang once, the sound thin but clear, carrying across Dry Creek like a quiet reminder that some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. And Whitmore adjusted his hat, settled it back onto his head, and began to walk, not fast, not slow, just forward, and she walked with him, not behind, not ahead, and together they moved through the space the crowd had opened without being asked, leaving behind a platform, a rope, and a silence that would not fade as easily as the dust. They did not speak as they walked, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything spoken too soon would feel smaller than what had already been understood, and the town stretched out ahead of them in that familiar way, wooden fronts sun-bleached and tired, doors half open, windows watching without admitting it, and every step they took carried a quiet weight, the kind that made people step aside without being asked, made conversations stop mid-sentence and not resume until they had passed, and Ayanna walked beside Whitmore with the same steady pace she had held on the platform, not rushed, not hesitant, as if the ground beneath her feet had always belonged to her and only now was remembering it. And the rope was gone, but its absence lingered, not on her wrists, but in the way the air around her had changed, freer, wider, like something that had been held too long had finally been released without needing to be named. And a man near the saloon door lowered his gaze as they passed, not out of guilt alone, but out of something harder to face, recognition, and another turned his hat in his hands, twisting the brim slowly, as if trying to reshape a thought that no longer fit the way it used to. And Whitmore did not look at any of them, not because he did not see them, but because he had already made his point where it mattered, and repeating it with his eyes would only cheapen it. And they reached the hitching post where his horse stood waiting, a tall bay with a calm that matched its rider, and he paused there, resting a hand lightly against the saddle, not mounting, not yet, just giving the moment room to settle. And Ayanna stopped beside him, her gaze drifting once across the street, taking in the edges of the town, the small details most people never noticed, a cracked sign hanging crooked, a bucket left overturned near a well, a child peeking from behind a doorway, before being pulled back gently by a hand that did not want to explain anything today, and she let out a slow breath, almost a sigh, but not quite, more like the release of something carried longer than it should have been, and she said, "They will say you bought me." And the words were not sharp, not accusing, just clear, and Whitmore considered them for a moment, eyes on the leather strap beneath his hand, before answering. They will say what they need to understand it. And that answer hung there, simple, but not easy, and she tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that felt less like questioning and more like measuring something that could not be seen directly. And after a second she said, "And what do you say?" And Whitmore finally looked at her fully, not past her, not through her, but at her, the way he had on the platform, and there was no hesitation in his voice when he replied, "I say you were never theirs to sell." And that was not a declaration, not something meant for the town to hear. It was a truth placed between them, quiet and solid, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, and something in her expression softened, not weakness, not relief, but recognition, the kind that comes when two people see the same line drawn in the same place. And she reached up then, slow, deliberate, to the collar of her dress, fingers brushing against something hidden just beneath the fabric. And for a second it looked like she might pull it free, but she did not. She only touched it, as if confirming it was still there, still real, and Whitmore's eyes followed the motion, just briefly, and something flickered there, quick, almost gone before it could be named, and he turned back to his horse, adjusting the reins, grounding himself again in the simple things, leather, weight, movement, and behind them, the town began to breathe again, quiet at first, then louder, voices returning in low tones, not laughter, not yet, but conversation, the kind that tries to make sense of something it cannot fully explain. And Crow was still on that platform, a distant figure now, but not forgotten. And a few men drifted away from him, one by one, not confronting, not apologizing, just leaving, because staying would require more than they were ready to give. And the sun shifted slightly in the sky, not enough to cool the air, but enough to change the angle of light across the street. And Whitmore finally lifted his foot to the stirrup, then paused, glancing once more toward Ayanna, not questioning, not instructing, just offering a moment, a choice that did not need to be spoken, and she understood it without words. Because some choices do not come with explanations, they come with space. And she stepped forward, not toward the horse, but past it, onto the open road that led out of Dry Creek. And she did not look back, not at the platform, not at the people, not even at Whitmore. And for a second he remained where he was, watching her go, the distance between them stretching slowly. And then he lowered his foot back to the ground, letting the stirrup swing once before settling. And he followed, not leading, not guiding, just walking. And the horse remained where it was, reins loose, as if it understood that not every journey begins in the saddle. And as they moved away from the town, the sounds of Dry Creek faded behind them, replaced by the quieter rhythm of wind across open land. And somewhere ahead, beyond the rise of dust and distance, something waited, not as a promise, not as a threat, but as the next step in a story that had not yet finished speaking. The road stretched ahead in a long ribbon of dust and quiet, the kind that carried no promise and no warning, just distance. And they walked it without speaking, their footsteps falling into a rhythm that did not need to be agreed upon, only followed. And behind them Dry Creek faded into something smaller than it had ever felt before, its buildings shrinking into shapes, its voices dissolving into the wind, until it was no longer a place but a memory already losing its edges. And Ayanna kept her eyes forward, not searching, not avoiding, simply seeing what lay ahead as it came, while Whitmore walked a half step behind, not out of hesitation, not out of caution, but out of something quieter, respect, maybe, or the understanding that not every path needed to be led. And the land opened slowly around them, the tight lines of the town giving way to wide stretches of dry grass and scattered rock, the air shifting, cooler somehow despite the same sun, as if distance itself carried a different kind of breath. And after a while, when the town had disappeared completely from view, Ayanna slowed just enough to let the silence settle deeper, and she spoke without turning, her voice steady as before. "You left once." And the words did not accuse, did not question. They simply placed a truth on the road between them, and Whitmore took a few steps before answering, not because he needed time to think, but because some answers deserved to arrive at their own pace. "I did," he said, and there was no weight added to it, no defense, just acknowledgement. And she nodded once, small, as if that was all she needed from that part. And then she asked, "Why come back now?" And this time he did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not a single thing, not something that could be carried in one sentence, without losing what mattered. And he looked out over the land ahead, the way the light hit the distant ridge, the way the wind moved through the grass in slow, uneven waves, and finally he said, "Because leaving did not change what I knew." And the words hung there, simple, but not easy, and she turned her head slightly, just enough to see him from the corner of her eye, measuring again, weighing not the words, but the way they were spoken. And after a moment she said, "And what do you know?" And this time he met her gaze without looking away. That some things only stop when someone stays, and that answer did not carry pride, did not ask for approval. It simply stood, the way a line stands when it has been drawn in the right place. And she held his gaze for a second longer, then looked forward again, and something in her shoulders shifted, not a release, not quite, but a settling, like a piece of the road had finally found where it belonged beneath her feet, and they walked on, the distance between steps and words growing again, comfortable now, not empty, and the sound of a bird crossed overhead, sharp and brief, cutting through the stillness before fading into the open sky, and after while they reached a low rise in the land, a place where the ground dipped slightly before climbing again, and Ayanna stopped there, not abruptly, just enough to mark it as a point, and Whitmore stopped as well, standing beside her now, and from that spot the view stretched wider, the kind of view that made a person feel both smaller and clearer at the same time, and she reached up once more to the collar of her dress, this time not hesitating, and she drew out the object she had touched before. A small piece of turquoise wrapped in worn leather, simple, weathered, but held with care, and she turned it slightly in her fingers, letting the light catch it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because some things do not need words to be recognized. And Whitmore's eyes rested on it, steady, and something deeper moved there, something tied to memory rather than the present, and she finally said, "You remember this." And it was not a question. It was a statement placed carefully, and he nodded once, slow, "I do." And the wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent of sage through the air, grounding the moment in something older than either of them. And she closed her hand around the stone, holding it for a second before letting it rest back against her chest, hidden once more, and she said, "You were not the only one who waited." And that line did not seek explanation, did not ask for anything in return. It simply completed something that had been left unfinished long before. This road, and Whitmore accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else she had said, without argument, without question, and they stood there for a moment longer, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full, like a space that had been cleared and filled again with something steadier. And then she turned and began walking again, not toward the town, not away from it, but forward, into the land that did not belong to anyone but held everyone the same, and Whitmore followed, matching her pace without effort, and behind them the road they had taken remained, marked only by faint tracks in the dust that the wind would soon erase, and ahead, the path was not visible yet, not fully, but it was there, waiting to be shaped, by the steps they chose to take, one after another, in a silence that no longer needed to be broken to be understood. The land did not change quickly, it never did, but there are moments when it feels like it does, when a ridge becomes a boundary, and the air carries something different on the other side. And as they crossed that low rise the wind shifted again, bringing with it a cooler breath from the west, and Ayanna slowed, not stopping this time, just adjusting her pace like she was listening to something beyond the sound of her own steps, and Whitmore noticed. Of course he did, because he had learned long ago that the land speaks first to those who belong to it, and only later to those who try to understand it. And he said nothing, letting her read whatever it was that moved through the grass and stone ahead. And after a few yards, she angled slightly off the worn path, not enough to seem deliberate, just enough to follow a line only she could see. And he followed without question, boots leaving the last trace of the road behind them, stepping into ground that held no tracks but their own, and the silence deepened there, not empty, but layered, the kind that carried distant sounds in ways a town never could. The faint call of a hawk, the rustle of something small moving through dry brush, the low hum of wind slipping between rocks, and she stopped again near a cluster of weathered stones, the kind that looked like they had always been there and would always remain, and she crouched slightly, fingers brushing the surface of one of them, not searching, not digging, just touching, as if confirming something that did not need to be seen to be known, and Whitmore stood a few feet back, giving her space without stepping away, and after a moment she rose, turning toward him fully for the first time since they had left the town behind, and her eyes held something different now, not the steady watchfulness from before, but a depth that reached further back, beyond Dry Creek, beyond this road, and she said, "Do you remember the river?" And the question came soft, but it carried weight, and Whitmore's expression did not change much, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition that did not need to be explained, and he nodded once. "North Bend," he said, and she gave the smallest sign of agreement. "After the flood," she added, and the words settled between them like a piece of a story that had been waiting to be spoken, and for a second the present seemed to pull back, making room for something older, something quieter, and Whitmore looked past her, not at the land as it was now, but at the memory of it, water running higher than it should, banks cut deeper than they had been, and a figure small against the current, and he said, "You should not have been there." And it was not a rebuke, not now, just a fact carried forward from another time, and she answered, "Neither should you." And that held no accusation either, only the same balance he had placed between them earlier, and the wind moved again, lifting a strand of her dark hair across her face before letting it fall back into place, and she reached up, brushing it away without breaking her gaze. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because some memories do not need to be retold to be understood, and then she said, "You did not ask who I was," and Whitmore shook his head slightly. It did not matter, and she studied him for a second longer, as if testing that answer against something deeper, and then she said, "It mattered to them," and the word "them" did not need explanation. It carried the weight of the town, the platform, the laughter that had filled that square. And Whitmore let out a slow breath, not heavy, not tired, just measured. "That is why it mattered that I stayed," he said, and there was no pride in it, no claim, only the continuation of a line he had already drawn, and she looked down briefly, not in thought, but in acknowledgement, and then back up again, and something in her expression softened just enough to be seen, just enough to change the space between them from distance to something closer, something shared, and she stepped past him then, moving further into the open land, and after a moment he followed, their paths aligning again without needing to be spoken into place, and the ground dipped slightly ahead, revealing a narrow stretch of water cutting through the earth, not wide, not deep, but steady, and she approached it without hesitation, kneeling at the edge, her fingers dipping into the current for just a second before pulling back, and she watched the ripples fade, her reflection breaking and reforming in the surface, and Whitmore stopped a few feet behind her, the same distance he had kept before, and she said, without turning, "You saved a life that day." And he answered just as quietly, "I did what was there to be done." And she shook her head once, small, almost a smile without being one. "You stayed," she said, echoing his own words back to him, and that carried more weight than anything else she had said, because it tied the past to the present in a way neither of them could ignore, and the water moved on, unchanged by what had been remembered beside it, and after a moment she rose, brushing her hands lightly against her dress, and turned to face him again, and there was no distance in her gaze now, no testing, no measuring, just a quiet certainty, and she said, "Then stay." And the words did not ask, did not demand, they simply opened a space, and Whitmore held her gaze, steady, and for a second the wind seemed to pause, the land holding its breath, and he gave a single nod, not dramatic, not grand, just enough, and together they turned from the water, stepping back onto the dry ground, moving forward again, not as strangers crossing paths, not as debts being settled, but as two people who had finally reached the same point on a road that had been leading them there long before either of them understood it. They moved on from the water without looking back, not because it held nothing for them, but because it had already given what it needed to give, and the land ahead stretched wider now, the kind of open that does not ask questions and does not offer answers, only space. And Ayanna walked with a steadiness that no longer carried the weight it had before, her steps lighter in a way that could not be seen unless you knew what had come before it. And Whitmore kept pace beside her, not matching her stride out of effort, but because something in the rhythm between them had settled into place, quiet and certain, and the wind picked up slightly, brushing against their coats, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and distant earth, and after a while the ground began to rise again, a slow incline that revealed more of the horizon with every step. And when they reached the top, the view opened fully, a wide valley stretching out beneath them, dotted with low trees and the faint outline of smoke rising far in the distance, thin and steady, and Ayanna stopped there, her gaze fixed on that line of smoke, and she did not need to explain it. Not yet, because some things are understood before they are spoken, and Whitmore followed her line of sight, taking in the distance, the way the smoke curled upward without urgency, the way it held its place against the sky, and he said, "Yours," not as a question, but as a recognition, and she nodded once. "They have been waiting," she said, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just a simple truth that carried more weight than anything said back in Dry Creek, and the distance between where they stood and where that smoke rose could not be measured easily, not in miles alone, but in what it meant to cross it. And Whitmore stood there for a moment, letting the sight settle, understanding what it represented without needing it explained, and he said, "Then we should not keep them." And she turned her head slightly toward him, studying him again, not testing this time, not questioning, but confirming. And after a second she gave a small nod, and they began their descent into the valley, the ground shifting underfoot from hard-packed dust to softer earth, the kind that held footprints longer, the kind that remembered who passed through it. And as they walked, the air changed again, cooler now, touched with the faint scent of water somewhere unseen, and the silence between them remained. But it was no longer the silence of strangers or even of shared understanding alone. It was something deeper, something that did not need to be filled because it already held everything it needed. And after a while, shapes began to form ahead, not clear at first, just suggestions of movement, of structure, and then more defined, low lodges, horses standing in small clusters, figures moving between them with purpose, and none of it felt rushed, none of it felt threatened. It simply existed, steady and grounded in a way Dry Creek never had. And Ayanna slowed her pace slightly as they approached, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, and Whitmore matched her without thinking, understanding that the distance here was not just physical, it was something to be crossed with care. And as they drew closer, one of the figures near the edge of the camp turned, noticing them before the others. And for a moment that figure stood still, watching, and then another turned, and another, until the movement spread quietly through the space, not alarmed, not startled, just aware, and no one reached for anything. No one stepped forward quickly. They simply watched, and Ayanna walked on, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and when she was close enough to be seen clearly, a man stepped forward from the center of the camp, older, his presence carrying a kind of quiet authority that did not need to be announced, and he stopped a few yards away, meeting her where she stood, and for a second neither of them spoke, because some reunions do not begin with words, they begin with recognition. And then he inclined his head slightly, and she returned it, equal, measured, and he said, "You took longer than the wind promised." And there was a hint of warmth in it, something that did not show easily, but was there all the same. And she answered, "The road asked for patience," and that seemed to satisfy him, because he gave a small nod and stepped aside, not inviting, not commanding, simply making space. And Ayanna moved past him into the camp, and Whitmore remained where he was for a moment, standing at the edge, not uncertain, but aware of where he stood, and the older man's gaze shifted to him then, studying, not unfriendly, not welcoming either, just measuring. And Whitmore met that gaze without flinching, without pushing, just present. And after a second the man said, "You walk with her." And Whitmore answered, "She walks her own path." And that response hung there for a moment. And then the man gave the smallest sign of approval, stepping aside just enough to extend the same space he had given her. And Whitmore stepped forward, crossing that unseen line, not as an intruder, not as a guest, but as someone who understood that some places are entered not by right, but by the way you carry yourself when you arrive. And as he passed, the eyes of those in the camp followed him, not hostile, not welcoming, just aware, and the sound of the wind softened again, as if the land itself had acknowledged the crossing. And somewhere nearby a child's laughter rose briefly, light and unburdened, cutting through the stillness before settling back into the rhythm of the place. And Whitmore exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in tension, just in recognition that he had reached a place where words would matter less than actions. And ahead, Ayana did not look back, not because she had forgotten him, but because she knew he would follow if he meant to stay. And behind him, the valley stretched wide and quiet, holding the road they had taken as something already complete, something that no longer needed to be walked again. The camp did not rush to greet him, and that was the first thing Whitmore understood as he stepped fully into it, that this place did not bend itself around newcomers. It remained as it was, steady and grounded, and those who entered it were the ones who had to adjust, not the other way around. And he moved with that awareness, his pace measured, his hands relaxed at his sides, not reaching, not claiming, simply present. And the eyes that followed him did not carry hostility, but they did not offer comfort either. They watched the way he walked, the way he held himself, the way he did not try to speak before understanding where he stood. And that was enough, for now. And Ayana had already moved ahead, greeted by a few with quiet nods, by others with hands placed briefly over her shoulders, not clinging, not dramatic. Just a recognition of return, and she accepted each of them the same way, steady, equal, never lowering herself, never raising above them. And Whitmore noticed that, the balance she carried, the way she belonged without needing to prove it, and it was different from anything he had seen in Dry Creek, where belonging was often measured by noise and claim, and here it was measured in silence and presence. And the older man who had met them at the edge remained nearby, not hovering, but close. Enough to observe, and after a few moments he stepped beside Whitmore, not directly in front, not behind, just beside, and said, "You do not look lost." And Whitmore answered, "I know enough not to pretend I am not." And that seemed to settle something between them, because the man gave a small nod and said, "That is a good place to start." And they stood there for a moment, watching the movement of the camp, the quiet rhythm of daily life unfolding without interruption, a woman tending to a small fire, a young boy guiding a horse with careful hands, an elder seated near a shaded spot, eyes half closed but aware of everything around him, and nothing in it felt hurried, nothing felt uncertain, and Whitmore let that settle into him. The difference between a place that reacted and a place that simply existed. And after a while Ayana returned, stopping a few steps away, her gaze moving between the two men, not uncertain, but aware of the space they shared now, and she said, "He stayed." And the words were directed to the older man, but they carried weight for Whitmore as well, and the man considered that, looking at Whitmore again, not longer this time, but deeper, and he asked, "Do you know what that means?" And Whitmore did not answer right away, not because he did not understand the question, but because he understood that the answer was not something to be given lightly, and after a moment he said, "It means I do not leave when it is no longer easy." And that answer did not carry pride, it carried weight, and the older man watched him for a second longer, then nodded once, slow, and said, "Then you understand more than most." And with that he turned, stepping away without dismissal, without invitation, simply returning to his place within the camp as if the matter had been acknowledged and needed nothing more. And Ayana remained where she was, her gaze still on Whitmore, and for a moment the sounds of the camp seemed to soften around them, not because they stopped, but because something in their space had drawn inward, and she said, "They will not ask you to prove yourself." And he replied, "They already have." And that was enough, because she gave a small nod, understanding what he meant without needing it. Explained, and she gestured slightly toward the center of the camp, not leading, not directing, just opening a path, and they walked together again, moving deeper into the space. And as they passed, the looks they received began to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, a shift from observation to something closer to acknowledgement. And one of the younger men inclined his head slightly as Whitmore passed, not a greeting, not quite, but not indifference either, and Whitmore returned it the same way, small, equal, and the balance held, and they reached a place where the ground had been cleared, a circle of packed earth with a fire pit at its center, not lit now, but prepared, and Ayana stopped there, her hand resting briefly against one of the stones that bordered it, and she said, "This is where decisions are spoken." And Whitmore looked at it, not as a place, but as a weight, understanding that what was said here did not disappear when the words ended, and he nodded once, not claiming a place within it, but recognizing it, and she watched him for a moment, then said, "You will be seen here." And there was no warning in it, no caution, just a fact, and he answered, "Then I will stand where I am." And that seemed to settle the space between them again, the same quiet understanding that had followed them from the road, and the wind moved lightly through the camp, stirring the edges of fabric, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, and somewhere nearby a child laughed again, the sound light, unburdened, and Whitmore allowed himself a small breath, not relief, not tension, just presence, and he stood there beside her, not as a man who had arrived, but as one who had chosen to remain, and in that choice something unseen shifted once more, not in the land, not in the people, but in the space between all of them, a line drawn not with force, but with quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to be defended to be real. The circle remained quiet long after they had stepped into it, not because there was nothing to say, but because this was not a place for quick words, and Whitmore understood that without needing it explained, he stood just outside the fire pit's edge, not crossing into the center, not claiming a place that had not been given, and Ayanna remained beside him, her presence steady, not shielding him, not presenting him, simply standing as she always had, equal, and slowly the camp began to gather, not in a rush, not called by any voice, but drawn by the same quiet awareness that had spread earlier, one by one, then two, then more, until a loose circle formed around the space, leaving distance, leaving room, and no one spoke at first, because here silence was not empty, it was part of the process. It allowed truth to settle before it was shaped into words, and the older man returned, stepping into the circle with the same measured calm, his eyes moving once across those gathered, then resting briefly on Ayanna, then on Whitmore, and he said, "The wind carried your steps before you arrived." And the words did not question, they acknowledged, and Ayanna inclined her head slightly. "The wind carries many things," she replied, and the faintest hint of understanding passed between them, and then the man turned his attention fully to Whitmore. "You come from a place that forgets quickly," he said, and Whitmore did not deny it, did not defend it, he simply answered, "That is why I remember." And that response did not fill the space, it settled into it, like something placed carefully where it belonged, and a murmur passed through the circle, not loud, not disruptive, just the sound of thought moving among people who weighed words before accepting them. And the older man stepped closer to the fire pit, placing his hand lightly on one of the stones, grounding himself as he spoke again. "She was brought to be sold," he said, and the sentence did not need more detail. It carried its own weight, and the eyes in the circle shifted, not toward Whitmore, not toward Ayanna, but toward the space between them, where the meaning of that moment still lingered, and Whitmore nodded once. "She was," he said, and then he added, "and she walked away." And that distinction did not raise his voice, but it changed the air slightly, because it placed the truth where it belonged, not on what had been done, but on what had followed, and Ayanna's gaze remained steady, not on him, not on the others, but on the circle itself, as if she was listening to something deeper than the words being spoken. And the older man considered Whitmore for a moment, then said, "You did not take her." And it was not a question, it was a statement shaped to see if it would hold, and Whitmore answered without hesitation, "No." And then, after a brief pause, he added, "I stood where she could not be taken." And that answer moved through the circle differently, not as sound, but as understanding, because it did not claim ownership, it did not place him above or below, it placed him beside, and that mattered more than anything else he could have said. And the older man's expression did not change much, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle recognition, and he said, "Then you understand the line." And Whitmore gave a small nod. "It was already there," he said. "I just did not step away from it." And the wind moved lightly through the circle, stirring the edges of clothing, carrying the faint scent of smoke from nearby fires. And for a moment no one spoke, because the meaning had already been placed, and adding more would only weaken it. And Ayanna stepped forward then, just enough to place herself at the edge of the fire pit, her voice calm, steady. "The town saw me as something to be priced," she said, and her words were not heavy, not burdened, they were clear. He saw the line they crossed. and she did not look at Whitmore when she said it, because she did not need to. The truth did not require direction, and the circle absorbed that, not with reaction, but with stillness, and the older man looked at her, then at Whitmore, and then out across the gathered faces, and he said, "A man is not measured by where he stands when it is easy," and he paused, letting the words settle, "but by where he remains when it is not." And that was not a judgment, not yet. It was a foundation, something to build the rest upon, and Whitmore did not respond, because there was nothing to add to that. And after a moment the older man stepped back from the fire pit, his gaze returning to Whitmore. "You have crossed into a place that does not belong to you," he said. And again there was no accusation in it, only truth, and Whitmore answered, "I know," and the man continued, "And yet you were not turned away," and Whitmore nodded slightly. "Because I did not come to take," he said, and that answer held the same quiet weight as the others, and the circle remained still, the decision not yet spoken, but already forming, not in one voice, but in many, shaped by what had been seen, what had been said, and what had not needed to be said at all. And the older man finally inclined his head, just once, a small motion, but enough. And he said, "Then you may stay." And the words were simple, but they carried more than permission. They carried acknowledgement, and Whitmore did not bow, did not thank. He simply stood, accepting it in the same way it had been given, steady, without excess. And beside him, Ayanna remained still, her gaze forward, and for the first time since they had left Dry Creek, there was no distance left between them, not measured in steps, not in words, but in something quieter, something that had finally settled into place. And the wind moved again through the circle, softer now, as if the land itself had agreed to what had been decided, and the fire pit remained unlit, because some moments do not need flame to be seen clearly. The circle did not break when the words were spoken. It simply loosened, like a held breath finally released, and people began to move again, not away, not in dismissal, but back into the rhythm of the camp that had never truly stopped, only paused. And Whitmore remained where he was for a moment longer, not because he did not understand what had been given, but because he understood what it required. And beside him, Ayanna shifted slightly, her shoulders easing in a way that spoke not of relief, but of alignment, like something long carried had finally found its proper place. And she turned her head toward him, just enough to meet his gaze without breaking the quiet around them. And she said, "They do not give that lightly." And he answered, "Neither do I take it lightly." And that exchange did not need more. It settled between them with the same weight as everything else that had passed. And the older man had already stepped away, blending back into the movement of the camp, not watching, not overseeing, because his part had been spoken and did not need to be repeated. And Whitmore finally stepped back from the edge of the fire pit, the packed earth holding the imprint of his boots for a moment before the wind softened it. And as he moved, a young boy crossed his path, carrying a small bundle of wood in both hands, careful, focused, and the boy slowed just enough to look up at him, not with curiosity alone, but with something steadier. And Whitmore inclined his head slightly, not speaking, and the boy returned it, the same small motion, and continued on his way. And it was a small thing, easy to miss, but it marked a shift, not in the camp, but in how Whitmore stood within it. And Ayanna noticed it too, though she said nothing, because it did not need to be pointed out, and the two of them walked away from the circle together, not toward any one place, just into the flow of the camp. And as they moved, the space around them adjusted, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, people no longer stepping aside out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, making room not because they had to, but because they chose to. And the difference was quiet, but it was there. And they came to a place near a low fire where an older woman sat, her hands moving slowly over a piece of woven fabric, her fingers steady despite the years they carried. And she did not look up as they approached, not immediately, but after a moment. She paused, lifting her gaze just enough to take them in, and her eyes rested on Ayanna first, softening slightly, then moved to Whitmore, studying him not with doubt, but with a kind of quiet assessment that felt deeper than judgment. And she said, "You brought the storm and left the dust behind." And Ayanna gave a faint smile, the kind that held more meaning than it showed. The storm was already there, she replied, and the woman nodded, as if that confirmed something she already knew. And then she looked at Whitmore again and said, "And you did not turn with it?" And Whitmore answered simply, "No." And the woman's gaze lingered for a second longer before she returned to her work, her hands moving again over the fabric. And that was enough. No approval spoken, no dismissal given, just a continuation, and they moved on, the sounds of the camp weaving around them, voices low, purposeful, the crackle of fire, the soft movements of horses nearby. And as the sun began its slow descent, the light shifted across the valley, stretching shadows longer, softening edges. And Ayanna stopped near the edge of the camp where the ground opened again toward the horizon, and she looked out over it, not searching, not measuring, just seeing. And Whitmore stood beside her, the same quiet presence he had carried since the road. And after a moment she said, "You could leave now." And the words were not a suggestion, not a test, just a truth placed clearly. And he did not answer right away, not because he needed to think, but because the answer had already been made before the question was spoken. And he said, "I know." And that was all. And she nodded once, accepting it, because she understood what he had not said. And the wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the distant sound of something unseen, something steady, and the light dipped lower, touching the edges of the camp in gold. And in that quiet, nothing more needed to be proven, nothing needed to be claimed. And for the first time since Dry Creek, Whitmore was not standing against something, not holding a line. He was simply standing within it. And that was enough. The evening settled over the valley the way truth settles into a man, not sudden, not loud, but undeniable once it arrives. And the light stretched long across the camp, painting everything in quiet gold. And Whitmore stood where the land opened wide, his silhouette steady against the fading sun, not as an outsider anymore, not fully as one within, but somewhere in between. And that space did not trouble him the way it once might have, because he understood now that belonging was not a place you stepped into. It was something you proved by staying when no one was watching. And behind him the camp moved with its usual rhythm, fires being tended, voices low, the soft sounds of evening settling into routine, and none of it asked anything from him. None of it demanded that he explain himself again, and that silence held more weight than any question could have. And Ayanna stood a few feet away, not facing him, not turning away either, simply sharing the same horizon. And after a while she said, "They will remember this." And her voice carried no pride, no warning, just truth. And Whitmore let that sit for a moment before answering, "So will I." And that answer did not try to match hers. It simply stood beside it, the way he had stood beside her. And she glanced toward him briefly, not searching, just confirming something she had already begun to understand. And then she said, "Dry Creek will not change overnight." And the name of the town felt distant now, smaller somehow, like something left behind not in miles, but in meaning. And Whitmore gave a slight nod. "It never does," he said. And then after a pause, "But it does not have to stay the same either." And those words were not hopeful in the way people usually meant it. They did not promise anything. They simply left the door open for something different. And Ayanna looked back toward the valley, the way the shadows stretched across it, the way the last light touched the far ridge, and she said, "Some places only change when they are made to see." And Whitmore's gaze followed hers, and he understood what she meant without needing it explained. And he said, "Then they have seen." And that was enough, because neither of them needed to argue what had already been done. And the wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the faint warmth of the day as it gave way to cooler air. And for a moment everything held still, not frozen, but balanced, like the world itself had paused to acknowledge something quiet, but lasting. And Ayanna reached once more to the small turquoise piece at her collar, her fingers resting against it briefly. And she said, "You did not know who I was that day." And Whitmore answered, "I did not need to." And she let out a breath, almost a quiet laugh, though it carried no sound. "Most men would have asked," she said. And he shook his head slightly. Most men were busy watching the wrong things. And that answer settled between them, simple, but heavy with meaning. And she turned then, fully facing him for the first time since they had reached the camp. And there was no distance left in her gaze, no testing, no questioning, just a clear recognition of what had been done and what had not needed to be said. And she said, "You saw the line." And Whitmore met her eyes, steady as always. "It was always there," he replied. "They just chose not to see it." And the wind lifted slightly, moving between them without breaking the stillness. And for a moment neither spoke, because everything that mattered had already been placed where it belonged. And then she nodded once, small, certain, and turned back toward the camp, taking a step, then another, not leaving him behind, but not waiting either, because she no longer needed to measure where he would stand. And Whitmore remained where he was for a second longer, watching the last of the sunlight slip beyond the ridge. And in that fading light, he understood something that did not need words. That what had happened in Dry Creek was not about winning, not about stopping one moment alone, but about choosing where to stand when no one else would. And that choice did not end when the moment passed. It followed you. It shaped the ground beneath your feet wherever you went. And he adjusted his hat slightly, not out of habit, but out of quiet acknowledgement. And then he stepped forward, following the path back into the camp, not because he had to, but because he had already decided he would. And as the night began to settle, the fire at the center of the camp was finally lit, its flame rising steady and calm, not wild, not consuming, just enough to hold back the dark. And Whitmore took his place near its edge, not inside the circle, not outside it either, but exactly where he had chosen to stand all along. And for the first time, there was nothing left to prove, only the quiet understanding that some lines, once seen, are never crossed again. The fire held steady through the night, its glow low and constant, casting long shadows that moved with the quiet rhythm of people who did not need to fill the dark with noise. And Whitmore sat near its edge, not at the center, not apart from it, just close enough to feel its warmth without claiming more than what had been given. And across from him Iana sat as well, her posture relaxed now, not guarded, not watchful, simply present in a way that spoke louder than anything she could have said. And around them the camp settled into that deep stillness that only comes when nothing needs to be proven, when every voice has already been heard and weighed. And somewhere beyond the firelight a horse shifted, leather creaking softly, and a child's quiet laughter faded into sleep, and the stars stretched overhead, sharp and endless. The kind of sky that makes a man remember how small he is and how much that does not matter if he stands in the right place. And Whitmore looked into the fire for a moment, watching the way the flames rose and fell without hurry, and he understood something then that had taken longer than the road, longer than the town, longer even than the years he had spent trying to step away from things he could not change. That justice was not something you carried like a badge or spoke like a promise. It was something you lived in the moments when no one asked you to, when no one expected you to. And Iana spoke into that quiet, her voice low, steady. "They will tell this differently." And Whitmore did not look up right away, because he already knew what she meant, and he answered, "They always do." And she let that sit for a second before adding, "In Dry Creek, they will say you took me." And there was no bitterness in her tone, just the clear understanding of how stories bend when people are not ready to face them straight. And Whitmore finally lifted his gaze, meeting hers across the fire. "Let them," he said, and his voice carried no weight of correction. No need to fix what would be said. It does not change where we stood. And that was enough, because she gave a small nod, accepting it, and the fire shifted slightly, a log settling inward with a soft crackle, sending a brief spray of sparks upward before they disappeared into the night. And she reached for the turquoise piece at her collar once more, not pulling it free this time, just holding it between her fingers as if grounding herself in something that had existed long before this day. And she said, "My grandmother used to say the line is not drawn in the ground." And she paused, her eyes lowering briefly to the fire. "It is drawn in the way a person chooses to see another." And Whitmore listened without interrupting, because some truths do not need to be met with answers. They need to be carried. And after a moment he said, "Then most of them were blind." And she gave the faintest smile, not at the words, but at the simplicity of them. "Not blind," she said, "just unwilling." And that difference hung there, quiet but sharp. And Whitmore leaned back slightly, resting his hands against the ground behind him. The earth cooled now as the night deepened, and he looked up at the sky, the stars unbroken by anything man-made. And he said, unwilling can change. And Ayanna followed his gaze for a moment, then shook her head gently. Only if someone shows them what they refuse to see. And Whitmore did not answer that, because he already knew it was true. He had seen it in the way the crowd had fallen silent, in the way Crow's voice had lost its edge, in the way the town had been forced, if only for a moment, to look at something it had long ignored. And the fire burned lower, not fading, just settling into coals that glowed deep and steady. And the camp around them rested fully now, the movements quiet, the voices gone, leaving only the sound of the wind moving gently through the valley. And Ayanna lowered her hand from the stone at her collar, letting it rest again against her chest, and she said, "You will go back one day." And it was not a question, it was a statement shaped by understanding, and Whitmore did not deny it, did not resist it. He simply said, "Yes," and she nodded, as if that completed something, and then she added, "When you do, they will look at you differently." And Whitmore considered that, not with pride, not with concern, just with the same quiet acceptance he had carried through everything else. And he said, "That is not why I will go." And she looked at him again, her eyes steady, and for a moment neither spoke, because the reason did not need to be said. It had already been lived. And the fire settled into a final low glow, the last of the flames, folding into embers that held their heat without showing it. And Whitmore stood slowly, not to leave, not to make a statement, just to move. And he stepped away from the fire, pausing once to look out over the valley, the same wide stretch of land that had greeted them earlier, now softened by darkness. And in that quiet he understood that nothing had truly ended, not the story, not the line that had been drawn, not the choice he had made. It would follow him wherever he went, in every place, where someone chose not to see. And he adjusted his hat once more, a small, habitual motion that carried more meaning now than it ever had before. And behind him the fire continued to glow, steady and quiet. And Ayanna remained where she was, watching not him, not the fire, but the space between, where everything that mattered had already taken root. And out here, far from any town that tried to name it, justice did not need to be spoken. It simply remained, in the way a man chose to stand, and in the way another chose to see it.